From KPRC2, this is Houston Newsmakers with Khambrel Marshall.
The sounds of protest was loud and strong inside the Israeli parliament this past week as the first of Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu's efforts to overhaul the country's judiciary was voted on. Outside, it was just as noisy, but with demonstrators against the move decrying it as the first step toward dismantling democracy. What is clear is that this is and was a big deal, and it requires a conversation with someone who knows that area and its politics. That's the Honorable David Satterfield, the director of the Baker Institute for Public Policy, former ambassador to Lebanon and Turkey and the Charge d'Affaires in Iraq and Egypt. He also leads the Edward Dejerian Center for the Middle East. Ambassador Satterfield, good morning. Thank you for joining me this morning.
Good morning.
You know, we've been seeing this vote coming in the Israeli parliament for quite some time. When it actually happened, your reaction and what do you think it might do to the relationship between the United States and Israel?
Well, a couple points off the top. The judicial reforms, including the so-called reasonableness vote that took place on Monday, has certainly precipitated a tremendous debate within Israeli society. It's unprecedented. But let's not forget, this was a democratically elected government. The vote passed by 64 to 56. We would be extraordinarily resistant to a foreign country telling us that a vote in the U.S. Congress passed by too slim a margin in order to be considered appropriate. So I would counsel a high degree of caution in critiquing this, not on the grounds of democratic process, but on the grounds of what does it do, these kinds of controversial measures, to stability within Israeli society. Why is that important to us? Because Israel is a critical ally, partner, friend of the United States in a deeply troubled region. We don't want to see Israel move in a direction of internal dissent, internal division so severe that it challenges Israel's ability to serve as a platform for greater rather than lesser stability. And that's what we're after in all of this. Greater stability, greater security, not just for Israel, but for the advancement and protection of U.S. interests in that region.
So some of the reasons that the prime minister gave for wanting to rein in the judiciary was because of what he called activist judges, something that we similarly hear from far right in our country about activism, activist judges. They do have a democratic process, but they don't have a constitution. So within that the way that works, how has this decision, do you think, impacted their democratic process? Because quite a few people, obviously, it looked like a large number of people were against this, and the vote was close as well. How do you think it's going to shape this? Because they're only 75 years old. They're not like the United States, which is still struggling several hundred years into our democracy.
Absolutely. Sure. Look, I think the challenge here, the real question is not whether Israel as a democratic state is being threatened, but what kind of democracy? It's really an issue of liberal versus illiberal democracy. And this debate and concerns about direction of policy and politics isn't unique to Israel. We see it here in the United States at a local as well as a national level. We see it in Europe. We see it in many of our partners and allies around the world. It's a legitimate question. What is the consequence of moving in an illiberal direction? But within Israel, the protests, which have only increased after the passage of this last and first piece of legislation on judicial reform, are extraordinary. You have up to 10% of the population engaging in protest at one time. That's our concern. Stability, unity, the ability of Israel to continue to function. What it does on judicial reform, judicial activism questions within its own country is as unique an Israeli issue to decide and debate as it is here in the United States. And I really feel strongly about this. We should not be attempting to shape the same kind of debate that we have here in the United States and see elsewhere. What we should be expressing concern about, and the administration has, are the consequences of lack of consensus on these issues.
So the President Biden, just before the vote, he made it known that he thought it would be unfortunate. It sounds to me like you would say, you know what, that's better just not to say anything and let this thing play out and then deal with the ramifications of it and kind of delve into how to work our way through the post-vote as opposed to getting in front of it.
Well, I think it is always wise in the conduct of international policy not to attempt to intervene in another democratic system's democratic decision-making process. The point is often raised, well, we have a right to do this because we provide $3.8 billion in assistance to Israel every year. And I don't agree with that. That assistance is provided for reasons intrinsic to U.S. national security interests. It's done on a bipartisan basis. It is not something which gives us a right to critique an issue as internal, as domestic, as debates over judicial activism.
Speaking of that, reports surfaced this past week that the president may be interested in working out some sort of deal between Saudi Arabia and Israel that would involve Palestinians as well. Your take on that? Have you heard anything about that?
Yes.
And what do you think that?
The administration is working, is my understanding, on an extraordinarily strategic arrangement with Saudi Arabia, in which we would enter into security assurances, formal security assurances for Saudi Arabia in exchange for specific measures by Saudi Arabia with respect to its relationship with China, which is an extremely aggressive national force in the Gulf. We would work an arrangement with Saudi Arabia on the pricing of hydrocarbons, that is, the currency used, which is now the U.S. dollar, of course, and not see Saudi Arabia move in the direction of potentially using the Chinese currency for hydrocarbon pricing. We would arrange an agreement on a thoroughly monitored and overseen Saudi civilian nuclear power endeavor, and other assurances, all of which speak to U.S. national concerns. I think this is an extraordinarily thoughtful and wise approach to confront the challenge posed by China. The challenge is posed by the possibility of alternate sources of civilian energy, nuclear energy for Saudi Arabia. And now we come to the Palestinian question. The administration is interested, is keen to see the Saudis offer some form of initiative or assistance and support for the Palestinians. If the focus of the administration's efforts is to secure Saudi financial assistance, in-kind assistance for critical Palestinian needs, I think that's a very good thing. If it is an attempt to construct some sort of conditionality in which Israel must take certain steps, Palestinian leaders must do something uncertain, and the Saudis don't get their deal with us based on what Palestinians and Israelis do, I would not think that that is particularly appropriate or useful. We should strike this arrangement purely in terms of how we assess U.S. national security interests as advanced by, with, and through Saudi Arabia. Now, this is good for Israel, of course, right, in that it secures a normalization, recognition by the one remaining critical Middle East country that hasn't entered into those kinds of relations. This step, Saudi-Israeli normalization, recognition, would be a big advance towards overall regional stability against the two biggest threats to U.S. interests, to Israel's interests, to regional interests, which are Iran and the intrusion of outside powers such as China and, of course, Russia.
Ambassador, I want to continue that conversation. If you'll stick around for a Newsmakers Extra, we can continue this. I love this conversation. Boy, it is what a tangled web there is in the Middle East. We'll talk more about that. Ambassador Satterfield, thank you for your time this morning.